What we want to talk about is what creates friction in sales and sales enablement, and why do they exist, and how can we eliminate that?
And I think one of the questions is how many people in the room here are involved heavily in sales enablement, either as a sales enablement leader or as just a senior sales executive? Because what we're going to talk about here today is really, how do we get the friction out of this process? Where does the friction come from? How does it interfere with our goals as leaders? And what do we need to do differently if we want to help our sales teams to be more successful?
So let's talk about what is, in your opinion, the foundation that we need to think about, because I think a lot of sales enablement leaders, they don't sit in very secure chairs.
Well, it's hard. I mean, if you think about all the things that we're trying to accomplish in sales enablement, we have a slide here that indicates, based on CSO Insights research in their 2019 report, what are the key activities that sales effectiveness, sales enablement is trying to accomplish, obviously other than revenue. Everybody wants more revenue. It starts with things like win rate. How do we increase the win rate when we call on prospects? How do we drive new account acquisition? How do we sell more to our existing accounts? How do we improve the experience? How do we engage our customer base? These are all things that people are trying to do. Of course, there's a productivity element to it as well. But if we think about these are what we're trying to accomplish, that helps us also to understand where the frictions can be. Because if we don't understand what our sales force is, who they are, and what's inside their heads, it's going to be hard for us to prioritize what we do in sales enablement. So I think that's where it becomes very interesting to say, well, if these are our goals, where does the friction come from? What's stopping us from achieving those goals?
So how do you get inside the salesperson's head, not just the team, but everybody?
Well, we know we're not getting inside their head successfully. So the same CSO Insights report shows that only 27.5% of sales enablement initiatives are successful according to what the expectations were organizationally. So that means almost 3/4 of us in the room here are running into trouble accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish. And that means there's a lot of friction out there, and we're not going to solve that problem. We're not going to improve that metric until we start to understand where the friction's coming from and what we have to do differently to change that. And when you really think about where is that friction coming from, what is the nature of that friction, we see a few things. One is organizations launch sales enablement initiatives expecting measurable results. They expect to invest a certain amount of economic resource, and they want to achieve a certain outcome. And when they can't show an improvement in the measured outcome, that's a serious issue. You have organizational issues. The sales force feels like they're wasting their time. They're spending time on things, energy on things that aren't producing results. The second is even when we find the right activities that could potentially produce the right results, we have inconsistent adoption. So we have some teams who succeed at it. We have other teams who don't embrace it. And so inconsistency of adoption becomes yet another friction. And then as we know, sales enablement initiatives are not free. They're not free in two different ways. One is economically, the amount of money that companies are investing to become good at sales is not trivial. But even more importantly, all of this engagement with the sales force carries bandwidth costs. That is, we're actually having to get share of mind with our sales force in order to accomplish these things. So if we're not hitting our results, we're burning through a lot of resources, and that's one of the primary frictions that we see as well.
So when you talk about measurable result, what comes to my mind is that a certain number of companies, they over-measure everything, and they're not clear what are the priorities. And other companies run the organization by guts and by intuition, and they have no measurement.
Yeah, I think part of it comes down to target selection. What are we going to work on in our sales enablement initiatives? And when we see how companies are thinking about it, it's almost like just tossing darts at a dartboard. So it's a gut feel that the CEO has, or a hunch that the sales leader has about what would lead to a better business outcome. It's very reactionary. We're having a problem with this month, so we're going to start focusing on that activity. We're going to go to a show and we're going to look for a technology that will solve that thing. And that kind of informal or let's just say gut feel approach to choosing sales enablement initiatives predictably produces a lot of misfires. If you contrast that with medicine, for example, they would never go to a patient who's complaining of pain and just randomly start cutting into that patient looking for problems. You don't just say, oh my God, I have chest pain, let's do open heart surgery. Or maybe it's something that's just the way they're thinking, let's cut into their head. And so what you have is this kind of crazy approach in sales enablement where people are trying to cut into things without really having done the right diagnosis up front that leads them to the right things to operate on. And so that basic blindness to what's causing sales friction is a big part of why people aren't hitting their goals.
So should there be malpractice suits for sales enablement managers and sales leaders?
Should there be what?
Malpractice suits.
Malpractice. Well, there is certainly, as we know, there's a perceived 75% malpractice level. So I don't know if that's the right answer, but we do have to get to the point where we start diagnosing before we prescribe. Right. And I think, if you're having sales enablement conversations organizationally and they're not data-driven, they're not informed by real metrics about what are the needs of our organization, then you're flying blind and you're subject to that type of a problem.
But I think to push the medical analogy a little bit further, when you look at 50 years ago in medicine, you had a stethoscope. And then all of a sudden technology moved to x-rays. And then from x-rays it moved to sonograms. And then from sonogram it moved to MRI. And so you have the technology evolution that gives you better diagnostic tools. So when you look at similarly to the situation in the sales office and the sales operations people or the sales leaders, sometimes they use just a stethoscope when there are a lot of tools available. And a lot of people also use tools that are totally obsolete, that give you absolutely no scientific basis for managing the sales force.
I'm just curious, how many people in the room have done Ancestry.com or 23andMe? Fair number. I think statistically, as we look around the country now, it certainly comes up that people are doing this. One of the interesting things is there's a parallel, which was what we call sales DNA, which is how do we find out the DNA characteristics of our sales force? And when we really start asking the question, who is in our sales force, both from a DNA perspective, like what are their mindsets, what are their belief systems, what are their competencies that they've either acquired through the way they view the world or the things they've learned, if we don't understand the DNA of the sales force, we're not going to have a very effective approach to how we engage with them.
See,
so it's crazy that this is going on. All these people are getting this Ancestry and sales, 23andMe, but how many of you have actually done an assessment of your sales force where you dig into their belief systems and their competencies before you engage in sales enablement? Raise your hand if you've already done that. Okay, it's a small number of people, but the critical question becomes, did it measure the right things? Was it a sales first assessment, or was it some kind of other assessment that was searching for personality or one of these other things that common instruments do? Sales enablement needs that kind of sales-focused assessment if we want to understand how to be successful at it.
And what gets me the most is that a lot of sales leaders talk about behaviors. We need to align the behaviors to the strategy and have people execute flawlessly. It sounds terrific. But again, what they're missing is the fact that behaviors are driven by what? Beliefs. So measuring beliefs is something almost nobody does. And yet the belief is the cause, the behavior is the symptom.
And that's where the DNA becomes so important, because if we don't understand the limiting beliefs of a sales force, it's very hard for us. We're going to go chase after, for example, some kind of a technology. But that's not going to fix the belief system of the people that are engaging with customers. If they don't believe, for example, that they are worthy of that deal, if they don't believe that they are comfortable talking about money, these are critical issues. That is going to affect whatever technologies they're using. That's going to change how effective they are. So these DNA types of things, what we want to understand is, what does it look like for the population of sales reps that we're working with? And then specifically, a lot of sales friction comes from, sales enablement friction comes from trying to pursue things at a macro level that need to be dealt with at a micro level. So there are individuals who have specific gaps. There may also be company-wide gaps, but understanding the distinction between macro and micro sales enablement is a huge distinction. A lot of friction comes from misunderstanding where you need to deal with those types of issues. Like we could say, for example, let's say we're trying to create a healthier, everybody in this room, we wanted them to be healthier people. Well, as a group of Americans, many of us are Americans, not all of us, but many people in the West, let's say, are watching too much TV. They're spending too much time on their phones. They're not eating healthy food. It would be an effective strategy for almost all of us to practice those things. That would be a good example of macro enablement. However, each of us individually has specific other challenges that would lead to health. Maybe it's sleeping more. Maybe it's using our brains in meditative ways, right? Reducing stress. Each of us has both a micro opportunity and a macro opportunity. If we start to view the sales enablement challenges as being both macro and micro, we can start to focus our energies on the things that make a difference. And I think that becomes a critical distinction as well. So one of the things I'd like to point out, a lot of companies, how many of you are trying to achieve faster organic growth? Raise your hand. Now, fast organic growth is obviously important in sales enablement, but how you pursue faster organic growth is up for debate. In fact, as a sales enablement team, you will have to answer the question, where are we going to focus our energies if we're going to generate faster economic growth, sales growth? I'm just going to show you a few examples of how data around talent can help to inform that critical decision. It's all about target selection. How quickly and accurately, precisely can you align on the right things to work on? If you align on the wrong things, where you misunderstand the distinction between macro and micro, you're not going to be successful. This is a simple donut chart, we call them, that explains for a particular sales team. There's 3 competencies that we're listing here. We have a complaint from our executive team, which is we're not generating enough organic growth. There's 3 potential ways we could tackle that. One would be our salespeople need to hunt more. They have call aversion. They're afraid to call on people they don't know. Frankly, they're not very good at that. A second idea is that they're not good at presenting. They get in front of the right people, but when they call on them, they're not identifying what's distinctive or valuable about what they do. That's an example of they're not presenting effectively. The third is they might be hunting enough and they might be presenting effectively, but they're presenting to the wrong people. They're wasting their energy on prospects and even customers, where fundamentally they're not prepared to buy. Sales enablement is as much about buyer enablement as it is about sales enablement. And if our sales team is spending their time with people who don't want to buy, that's a big problem. So here what we're showing you is for a particular team, what is the competency level of this team at these 3 activities? We have to choose how we're going to address this problem. Here we have the hunting problem. We see that 5 individuals are green, 9 individuals are yellow, and 4 individuals are red. We have a 56% overall effectiveness in that competency. We compare that to presentation approach. We have a 10 and 8. We have some good performance there. The number overall is pretty good. But look at qualifying. Qualifying has a big problem with it. Not only do we only have 2 people who are good at it, that's the green, we have 12 people who are mediocre and 4 who are poor. So what these data are telling us now is instead of focusing on hunting and presentation approach, we have a much narrower question, which is how do we help them to spend their time with the right people? So this is a very surgical approach to identifying what is the root cause of the problem. And then as a good surgeon now we're going to open up this problem and we're going to dig in even deeper. And we want to see how does this problem of qualifying vary across individuals. And one of the great things about these types of analytics is that you can see in that sort of on the left side, you can see a whole bunch of X's. There's a bunch of competencies here. It's a little bit of an eye chart, but basically what it tells us is that our entire sales team here struggles to influence the decision-making process. What can we glean from that? Rather than going out and buying some fancy technology or some new training program, we need to have a focused effort in our sales enablement function of helping our salespeople to learn how to influence the decision-making process of their customers. So that's a macro one. But now look across each of the individuals, and what do you see? You see that there are some problems that are not macro, they are micro in nature. That is, you can see in the bottom row, Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, who's performing here shortly. Steven Tyler is actually struggling with a lot of things. And it might be just the way he dances, I don't know. But he's not paying attention to a bunch of things. So Steven's going to have a very different remediation path compared to, for example, Tina Turner, who's seemingly successful at most of the things that she does. What's the implication of that? There are both macro opportunities, which we've precisely surgically selected here, which is how can we influence the decision-making process? And then there are manager-rep conversations, which are personalized, which help to deal with the specific gaps of each individual. So you can see how we're eliminating friction because we're measuring before we cut. We're measuring at the macro level to figure out what are the macro problems in sales enablement, and then we're measuring at the micro level to dig in deeper to understand what are the personal paths to succeeding here.
And also you can prioritize where you're going to attack it first.
Yeah, so we've already jumped from disqualifying, if we go back to the previous slide, we ruled out 2 approaches.
Right.
We got to one, now we dug in deeper to that one, and we understood what the macro dimension was and what the micro dimension was. So that, in and of itself, is going to save huge amounts of money. Think about how much money we just saved because we got to that insight. And furthermore, we're not wasting our time trying to deal with all these topics across the entire organization. We've selected one, and maybe there's one this month, and after we master that, we move on to one next month that maybe has all but one individual. But then, even more importantly, we set it up for deployment success. Remember, we talked about how mediocre or incomplete deployment was a real problem. The reason deployment often doesn't succeed is it's not personalized. And so that's yet another critical insight that comes from these types of analytics. So there's a lot of great ways that you can get started on this. I think the most important thing for people to think about if you're trying to boost your effectiveness in sales enablement is have a data-driven conversation organizationally about what you're going to work on. If you haven't used data, and what I mean by that is DNA data, competency data. Who are these people that we're trying to enable? What are their specific challenges? If we have a data-free conversation, we shouldn't expect measurable outcomes. And I think that's probably one of the most important insights here. Choose enablement and training projects based on needs and not guesswork. Because when you do things based on guesswork, you're setting up the sales organization for frustration. And you're going to be less successful as a result of that. You only get so much bandwidth, you only get so much money. At the end of the day, you're going to have careful target selection and understand the distinction between macro and micro. And then really creating the metric system that doesn't just look at this once as a one and done snapshot, but how are we tracking? If we work on that issue of influencing the decision-making cycle, how much better are we at that 90 days from now than when we started? Are we ready to move on, or have we still got to do more work addressing that basic issue? And what specific goals have individuals addressed over that period to move the needle? And that's really where we see the big opportunity here is being able to have data-driven conversations in this way.
So Dave, can you explain analyze performance and competency data? How long does it take to do?
So we offer an assessment. It's called our Talent GPS product, and what it does, it's based on OMG, Objective Management Group, and our own ability to bring sales insights into that. It takes about 45 minutes for a sales rep to complete it. Think about how many hours of time you might ask a sales force to spend time on things over the course of the year. I would argue those 45 minutes are the best minutes of your sales enablement journey, because they're going to allow you to rule out wasting money on things, wasting time on things. They're going to help you understand the distinction between macro and micro and build a sales enablement path, a journey that makes sense for both the organization as well as the individuals. So it doesn't take a lot of time, it takes intent. And I think that's what distinguishes a great sales enablement initiative is the understanding of insight and the commitment to pursuing that insight.
So to draw another analogy that comes to my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds to me like when you build a house with a builder versus with an architect, there's a huge difference. The builder gives you the
blueprint.
right, but the architect draws the blueprint so it fits your needs.
Yeah, and I think you can always tell. I mean, if you see a crazy-looking house, it was probably somebody who built it themselves.
Right.
Right. And everybody has one of those somewhere around the neighborhood. But when you see that, you understand the squandering of resources, right? Because that was not free. Some of the smartest time that could have been spent was thinking up front, what are we trying to accomplish here? The old joke is ready, fire, aim. Right. And that's what sales enablement is when you don't have great data. You're firing before you are prepared to
it's very similar. We had a Four Seasons hotel, and we did a cover story on Isidore Sharp, who founded the Four Seasons. And he said that he requires the architect to live in the room that they designed for at least a month before he approves the design. And
that, I think you can see the analogy to sales. And too often we build sales enablement initiatives without really understanding the downstream consequences.
So would it make sense for a sales enablement manager to go through their own onboarding process?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's called eating your own dog food. And if you believe in what you're doing and you believe it's worthy of the sales force's time and energy, you need to go through it. I think one of the things that, if you're curious about how does an assessment like this work, we have a breakout session at 1:10 in the breakout room B. You'll get into more of the details of what kind of insights would you get? How would you act upon this type of information to define your sales enablement journey? And I think it's a great way for you to make sense of how to get rid of friction in this whole thing.
So the OMG assessment has been done with how many salespeople already?
Approaching 2 million. So it is the only sales first instrument that measures the specific behaviors that are related to sales. And secondly, it has a very high validation rate. Third-party validate over 95% accuracy. What Sparks IQ brings to this process is the ability to not only get the DNA data, but also to relate it to the CRM or other performance data, the analytics of sales performance. And that's really the magic here, is being able to tie the business outcomes that we observe through data back to what's going on in the heads of the people who are creating this.
What I like about it is it digs into the belief system of salespeople. So, for example, if you get the data and you measure the need to be liked, and then you look at the top salespeople versus the bottom, only 11% of the people that are at the top have a need to be liked. And 87% of the people that are at the bottom have a need to be liked.
Yeah, and you just tie that back to negotiation. So one of our company's key content platforms is negotiation skills. Is your company getting paid for the value that you bring to the customer? Very simple question. Well, if you have a high need to be liked, I predict you're going to do terribly in negotiation. And that need to be liked means you're going to be serving the customer's interests and not your shareholders' interests. And that's just one example. How many of you are suffering with sales reps who have undisciplined, rampant discounting problems? Okay. I mean, would you like to know where that's coming from? Would you like to know which individuals are going to, no matter how much training you throw at them, are going to struggle with that? That is a core set of findings. There's a million others like that. And that's what makes the instrument so interesting. I want to leave time for question and answer because we've been having a great conversation. What are the questions that are on your minds? Raise your hand and we'd be happy to.
Where's our cube? Callum, you raised your hand earlier when you said that you're doing measurements. Can you share with us what you're doing in your new company?
And what did you find?
Hi, thank you, Gerhard, for calling me out like that. I love that when that happens. Yeah, we're a part of a PE portfolio firm and have a sales accelerator type DNA analysis that are used across all of the portfolio companies. And typically it's used for onboarding, or rather acquiring talent, so that when they come in, you kind of know who you've got. And the project that we're in the middle of is applying that to the rest of the sales organization. We've had 8 acquisitions in the last 3 years.
Wow.
And typically you don't do the same kind of things for acquired talent coming in as you do for an
Existing.
organic hire off the street. So it's a great opportunity for us to assess who all do we already have in our organization that may have come on board at acquisition or before we put this process into place. And what's interesting is finding how many of them are not suited to a sales role. There's also validation around that top 20% that get us 80% of what we need. And that really helped us create a success profile, which we then used in the hiring process and put criteria in place for candidates to even be allowed to speak to a manager. And let me rephrase that, allow a manager to speak to the candidate. It gave us a gate to put in place early, which includes me as a VP of Sales Enablement hiring all field rep candidates that come in to be able to push back on talent and say, why are you even having my manager try to talk to this person? They don't meet the criteria we've put in place. So we're in the middle of all of that. It's a little bit of a science experiment right now. And it unearths something that is probably pretty common, which is the manager believes sometimes that a warm body is better than the right body, and they're just so desperate to get the capacity, they're not really thinking about how do I get the capacity in a way that allows me to be more hands-off and move on to the next thing. And so through the process, we're really calling out, if you hire this individual who does not meet the success criteria, here's what you as a manager will have to do and be responsible for, and you'll likely ramp them slower.
And you're going to bring in more friction. I mean, that's the
right.
whole thing.
And we turn it into the language of here's what it means for you as the manager, the work you're going to have to do because you're not finding somebody that better meets the profile. So like I said, it's a big science experiment, but it's allowed us, the data's allowed us to put some gates in place that help hold managers accountable for who they're really hiring and put requirements on the talent team to not just send anybody through because they were a referral from someone, and then really push back on the manager in such a way that they kind of say, oh gosh, you're right. I need somebody that's going to make my life easier, not harder.
And that is, in a nutshell, what's causing friction is we're not being discerning enough in who we're bringing on, how we're assigning them to roles. There's all kinds of friction that comes from a basic lack of insight into what's causing the problem. Since you let the cat out of the bag, I will mention that private equity is broadly interested now, as is the investment community, and what are the opportunities for talent arbitrage. So these types of instruments can be obviously used to assess which companies in an industry are platform companies, which are bolt-ons. They have valuation multiple implications. If you're not using talent analytics, then you don't really understand your position in the ecosystem, and it's very hard for you to make sense of what you should do next. So it's a great insight from private equity, which is, by the way, how all companies should be thinking about it in a certain way, which is maximizing enterprise value and relating talent in human capitalism.
One more question.
I think there's one over here.
So I heard about the analytics that you're doing for talent acquisition. How do you prevent your employees from not becoming that data point that we talked about earlier?
Not feeling like a data point?
Right, because I think a lot of hiring is not just what's on my resume and like what kind of standardized test can I pass, you know? There's a lot of, especially in sales, a lot of personality that goes into that I don't think can come through analytics.
Yeah. I think there's two, and first of all, it's a great question because if you can't answer that question, you're going to create a lot of friction in and of itself. So I would say the first answer to that question is, what is it in it for the individual? And what these types of metrics allow you to do is to build a personalized development plan that leads to better outcomes. So that personalization of the sales improvement journey is critical to your commitment to that employee, that you are investing in their future. The second is organizational. You have to explain to the organization that we can't figure out how to use your time effectively and our money effectively if we haven't done an assessment of what we're good at and what we need help with. So it's both personalized and it's also organizational. And that, when it's done properly, is the crux of an effective sales enablement initiative. So thank you all for your time. We have a booth outside. We'd be happy to talk to people. And again, at 110 in breakout room B, you can learn a lot more about this. It's truly is one of the keys to getting rid of friction in sales enablement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.